On a humid summer evening in Boston, the Starfish restaurant on Harbor Point's waterfront hosted its usual parade of illustrious and discreetly arrogant clientele. The ambient sounds of silverware, muffled laughter, and instrumental music blended, with the distant noise of waves breaking against the rocks. Impeccably set tables reflected the standard of a place where only those who didn't ask the price would sit. At one of these tables, businessman Mark Richardson, wearing a light linen suit and with a distant gaze, stared at his untouched plate of grilled octopus with smoked chickpea puree. The glass of white wine reflected the amber lights of the environment, but his eyes were fixed beyond the dining room. At 38, Mark was one of the most talked about names in Boston's business scene, known for his calculated coldness in business and his ability to transform companies on the brink of bankruptcy into profit machines. His fortune was a source of fascination in business magazines, but his personal life was shrouded in silence. Never married, no children, few friends, he lived in a penthouse on Beacon Hill, where even the air seemed too conditioned for emotions. For him, routine consisted of spreadsheets, investments, and solitary dinners in places like this. On that particular night, there were no meetings or social events, just an uncomfortable emptiness that insisted on accompanying him. And it was, in this moment of internal silence, that something out of the ordinary happened. A small figure approached discreetly from the side of the restaurant, going unnoticed by most of the waiters and customers. Her bare feet, dirty with sand and asphalt, contrasted with the cold floor of the restaurant. The floral dress, now faded, and too loose, swayed in the breeze. When the girl stopped beside Mark's table, the visual impact was immediate but not noisy. In a low but firm voice, she said, "Mister, can I eat the rest?" The phrase hung in the air like a dissonant note in a perfect concert. Nearby customers paused for a moment but pretended not to see. A waiter prepared to intervene, but hesitated upon noticing that Mark, instead of rejecting the girl, had slowly lowered his gaze, staring at the child with an indecipherable expression. She didn't ask for money. She didn't cry. She just asked for the leftovers. This absence of theatricality in the request had an even deeper effect on Mark. He made a discreet gesture to the waiter, requesting another plate, without saying a word to the girl who hesitated to move away or accept. Renato, the maitre d', who had known Mark for years, approached discreetly. "Mr. Richardson, would you like me to escort the young lady to the exit?" "No," Mark replied dryly. "Bring a plate for her, the same as mine, but replace the octopus with shrimp." The maitre d' hesitated for a second, but nodded. "As you wish, sir." The girl remained standing, her large dark eyes fixed on Mark's still untouched plate. There was an almost adult dignity in her gaze, as if she had already lived too much for her age, which Mark estimated to be around 9 or 10 years old. "Sit down," said Mark, indicating the chair across from him. "What's your name?" "Emily," she replied, still hesitant. "I'm Mark. You can sit, Emily. The food will arrive in a few minutes." She sat with caution, as if fearing the chair might disappear at any moment. Her small hands, with short, dirty nails, rested on her lap, while her eyes scanned the restaurant, absorbing details. The paintings on the walls, the flower arrangements, the silver cutlery, the crystal glasses. Emily seemed to mentally catalogue each object, each detail, like someone visiting a museum for the first time. "Do you live around here?" asked Mark, trying to fill the awkward silence. Emily merely shrugged, a gesture that seemed to say more or less without committing to an exact answer. "And your parents?" Her eyes darkened a bit. "My mum isn't here anymore. I was with Mrs. Wilson, but she got sick." Mark felt a knot in his stomach. The casual tone with which the girl spoke of her abandonment was more disturbing than any crying or lamentation. Before he could elaborate another question, the waiter arrived with a steaming plate of grilled shrimp, with the same chickpea puree that accompanied Mark's plate. "You can eat," he said, observing how the girl looked at the plate with a mixture of hesitation and wonder. Emily picked up the fork carefully, as if it were a precious object that might break. She cut a piece of shrimp and slowly brought it to her mouth. Her eyes closed for a moment as she savored it, and Mark realized it had probably been a long time since her last complete meal. "Is it good?" he asked, more out of social habit than doubt. She nodded, continuing to eat with a curious combination of contained hunger and precision. She didn't devour the food as might be expected, but ate in small, deliberate portions as if wanting to prolong the experience as much as possible. Mark observed discreetly around him. Some customers still cast disapproving glances in their direction, while others seemed to make a point of ignoring the unusual scene. A middle-aged man at the next table muttered something to his companion, who smiled with disdain. Mark felt a growing irritation at these reactions, something unusual for someone who had always cared so much about appearance and others' opinions. "Can you read?" he asked, turning his attention back to Emily. "A little," she answered between forkfuls. "I went to school before everything." "And what do you like to do, Emily?" She finished chewing before answering, "Drawing. I like to draw the sea." Something in that simple answer touched Mark. There was an almost painful authenticity to the girl. As she ate, he observed her with growing curiosity. Why had this specific child awakened his interest? Why hadn't he simply sent her away, as he normally would have? When she finished eating, Emily wiped her mouth with the cloth napkin, imitating the gestures she had observed at other tables. "Thank you, mister. It was very good." "Mark," he corrected. "You can call me Mark." She nodded but didn't repeat the name. Her eyes now scanned the restaurant as if looking for a discreet exit. "Where will you sleep tonight?" asked Mark, surprising himself with the direct question. Emily shrugged again. "There's a stairwell near the market. It's quiet." There. The naturalness with which she spoke of her situation was disconcerting. There was no self-pity, just a pragmatic acceptance of reality. "Don't you have any relatives, nobody who can take care of you?" "I don't know. There was Mrs. Wilson, but she—" Emily left the sentence unfinished, as if sparing Mark the details. Was a kindness on her part. Mark stared at his own plate, still untouched. The food that had seemed bland before now seemed an obscene symbol of privilege. With a gesture, he called the waiter and asked for the bill. "You can go," he said to Emily. "But if you want, you can come back here tomorrow. I'll be at this same table at 8 o'clock. The girl's eyes lit up for an instant, but soon returned to their cautious expression. Why? The question, so simple and direct, caught Mark off guard. Why indeed? He himself couldn't explain. "Because sometimes people do things without a clear reason," he finally answered. "Maybe I just want to have company for dinner." Emily smiled for the first time, a small smile that didn't show her teeth but illuminated her eyes. "I'll come back then," she said, standing up. "Thank you for the food, Mark." She pronounced his name carefully, as if trying out the sound. Then, with the same discretion with which she had arrived, she slipped between the tables and disappeared through the side entrance of the restaurant. Mark remained seated for a few minutes, looking at the empty plate in front of him. Something had changed inside him, a small crack in a structure he thought was perfectly sealed. For years he had built his life like one builds a building, functional, imposing, admired from a distance, but fundamentally empty. And now, a barefoot child had found a breach in that construction. As he left the restaurant, he instinctively looked to both sides of the street, as if expecting to find Emily. But she had already disappeared into the Boston night, taking with her only the promise of a reunion and leaving behind a man suddenly conscious of the emptiness surrounding him. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The next morning, Mark woke up with the strange sensation that something had changed. The sun entered through the large windows of his penthouse on Beacon Hill, illuminating the minimalist apartment with straight lines and neutral colors. Everything was in its proper place. The designer furniture, the carefully selected contemporary artwork, the privileged view of Boston Harbor. However, for the first time in a long time, all that space seemed strangely empty. During breakfast, prepared by Susan, his longtime housekeeper, Mark found himself thinking about the girl from the restaurant, Emily. There was something in the way she had pronounced his name before leaving, as if testing a new word in an unfamiliar language. "Are you all right, sir?" asked Susan, noticing his prolonged silence. "You've barely touched your coffee." Mark looked at the abundant table: fresh bread, cut fruit, natural yogurt, freshly squeezed orange juice, and thought of Emily's bare feet. "I'm fine," he answered, automatically, just distracted with a new project. The day at the office proceeded like any other: meetings, phone calls, strategic decisions. Richardson Enterprises occupied 3 floors of a commercial building in Boston's financial center, and Mark moved through those corridors with the authority of someone who had built every inch of that empire. His employees treated him with a mixture of respect and fear. His presence imposed immediate silence in any room. However, on that specific day, part of him seemed absent. At 6 in the evening, he dismissed his driver, something unusual in his routine. "You can go, Anthony. I have an appointment at Harbor Point and prefer to drive." The employee nodded without questioning. Mark rarely drove his own car, a silver Mercedes that seemed more like an exhibition piece than a vehicle for daily use. As he drove through the busy streets of Boston, he felt a growing restlessness. What if Emily didn't show up? Worse yet, what if she did? What would he do then? Offer another meal and send her away again? The idea bothered him in a way he couldn't explain. He arrived at the Starfish earlier than agreed. He requested the same table as the night before and ordered only sparkling water while he waited. The minutes passed slowly: 7:30, 7:45. At exactly 8 o'clock, his eyes didn't stop searching the side entrance where Emily had appeared. 8:15, 8:30. Mark had already dismissed the waiter twice, saying he was still waiting for someone. At 9 o'clock, he felt a mixture of disappointment and relief. She wouldn't come. Perhaps it was better that way. That brief interaction had already disturbed his routine more than he would like to admit. He was about to ask for the bill when the Boston sky, which had threatened rain since the afternoon, finally came down in an intense downpour. The rain fell in dense curtains, transforming the harbor lights into diffuse blurs. It was at this moment that he saw her, a small figure running along the sidewalk, trying to protect herself from the rain with her hands over her head. The same floral dress, now soaked, clung to her fragile body. Without thinking twice, Mark took the jacket he had left on the chair beside him and went out to the restaurant's veranda. He saw Emily take shelter under the awning of a closed shop a few meters away. Seeing him approach with the umbrella, she showed no surprise, only a kind of resignation. "I thought you wouldn't come," he said, extending the jacket to her. "I had to get some things," Emily replied, accepting the oversized jacket that now enveloped her like a blanket. "I thought you had already left." "Not yet." Mark hesitated, observing the girl, trembling slightly. "Are you hungry?" She nodded, without false modesty, but also without desperation. An old hunger, already familiar. "Come," he said, guiding her back to the restaurant. This time, the looks were even more evident. The soaked girl, wrapped in an expensive men's jacket, seated at the table of one of the most powerful businessmen in the city. But Mark no longer cared. He ordered a hot soup to start, followed by the same dish as the night before. "Did you go to school today?" he asked while Emily warmed her hands on the soup bowl. "I haven't been to school in a long time," she replied, blowing on the spoon before tasting it. Since she left." Mark noticed the pause, the careful choice of words. "And where do you keep your things? You mentioned you went to get something today." "There's a space under the market staircase," she explained naturally. "Mr. Joaquin lets me keep my backpack there. He sells fruit." Each of Emily's answers was like a small blow. The simplicity with which she described her precarious situation made everything even more disturbing. "Where do you take a bath? How do you manage when you're sick?" Emily shrugged, that same gesture that seemed to say everything and nothing at the same time. "There's a faucet behind the market. When it rains, that's good too, and I don't get sick much." As they ate, the rain continued to fall heavily. The thunder made the restaurant windows vibrate slightly. Mark observed how Emily startled with each boom, but tried to hide it. "Are you afraid of storms?" he asked. "A little," she admitted. "It's hard to sleep when it rains like this." It was at this moment that Mark made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. It wasn't an elaborate plan nor a dramatic epiphany. It was just the simple realization that he could not, in good conscience, let that child return to a stairwell on a stormy night. "Emily," he said, keeping his voice firm to hide his own uncertainty, "would you like to sleep in a dry place tonight? I have a guest room in my apartment, just for tonight until the rain passes." Her eyes widened slightly, a mixture of hope and distrust. "Why?" she asked, the same direct question as the night before. Mark realized that any rehearsed answer would sound false to someone who, like Emily, had learned to detect lies out of necessity for survival. "Because it's raining," he answered simply, "and because nobody should sleep on the street on a night like this." Emily studied his face for a moment, as if looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives. Finally, she nodded. "Just until the rain stops," she agreed. The journey to Mark's apartment was made in silence. In the car, Emily kept the jacket tightly closed around her, her eyes fixed on the city passing by the window. Occasionally, a stronger thunder made her shrink, but she quickly resumed her posture. When they arrived at the luxurious building on Beacon Hill, the doorman looked strangely at the girl but didn't dare to ask questions. In the elevator, Emily watched fascinated at the illuminated buttons and the mirror that reflected her image, a small girl with wet, dark hair and a jacket that seemed to swallow her. Mark's apartment occupied the entire top floor of the building. When he opened the door, Emily stopped at the threshold as if afraid of contaminating that immaculate environment with her presence. "You can come in," said Mark, indicating the way. "I'm going to call Susan to prepare a hot bath for you." Emily entered with hesitation, her bare and dirty feet leaving marks on the white marble floor. Her eyes scanned every detail, the leather sofas, the artwork on the walls, the floor-to-ceiling windows revealing the night view of the city. "It's beautiful." "Tahir," she finally said. Susan appeared in the living room, interrupting the moment. Upon seeing the soaked girl in the middle of the room, she widened her eyes in shock. "Susan," Mark quickly said, "this is Emily. She's going to spend the night here. Can you prepare a bath and set aside some clean clothes?" The housekeeper, who had worked for Mark for over 10 years, had never seen him bring a child home, much less a visibly street child. Her face revealed confusion, but years of professional discretion prevented her from asking questions. "Of course, sir, I'll prepare the guest room as well." Turning to Emily, she softened her expression. "Come with me, dear. Let's get those wet clothes off." Emily looked at Mark as if asking permission. He nodded slightly, and only then did she follow Susan down the hallway. Alone in the living room, Mark tried to process what he was doing. He, who kept everyone at a distance, who had built his life around the idea of independence and control, had brought a complete stranger into his home, a child, a street child. If his associates knew, they would think he had gone mad. Perhaps he had. He poured himself a drink and walked to the window. The rain continued to punish the city, creating a curtain of water that distorted the lights below. The thunder that sounded made the crystal chandelier tinkle, and Mark thought of the small figure who shrank with each boom. Half an hour later, Susan reappeared in the living room. "The girl is in the bath now, sir. I set aside an old t-shirt of yours for her to use as a nightgown. Tomorrow I can provide some appropriate clothes." "Thank you, Susan." Mark hesitated. "Did she say anything? About her situation?" "Not much, sir. Only that her mother is no longer with her and that she was under the care of a Mrs. Wilson who became ill. It seems she's been on the street for a few months." Susan paused. "If I may ask, sir, what do you intend to do with her?" It was a fair question, for which Mark had no answer. "For now, just give her a dry night and a decent bed," he replied. "Tomorrow we'll think about what to do." Susan nodded, not seeming entirely convinced. "I prepared a light snack for her before bed. She was clutching her backpack the whole time, wouldn't let go. She finally agreed to leave it beside the bed. "Thank you, Susan. You can go home now. I'll take care of the rest." After Susan left, Mark remained in the living room, uncertain about what to do next. Finally, he decided to check on Emily. He walked down the hallway to the guest room and knocked lightly on the door. "May I come in?" he asked. "Yes," replied the small voice from the other side. Upon opening the door, Mark found Emily sitting on the edge of the king-size bed, looking even smaller in the white t-shirt that served as a nightgown. Her dark hair, now clean, fell in damp curls over her shoulders. Beside the bed, the worn backpack seemed like an alien object in that refined environment. "Are you comfortable?" he asked, maintaining a respectful distance. Emily nodded, her small hands smoothing the Egyptian cotton sheet. "The bed is very soft. If you need anything during the night, my room is the last one down the hall," explained Mark. "Or you can use the intercom next to the bed to call the front desk." Emily looked at the intercom as if it were an object from another planet. "Thank you, but I think I'll sleep well. I'm tired." A particularly loud thunder made the girl jump slightly. Mark noticed but pretended not to see. "Good night, then," he said, retreating to the door. "Mark," called Emily when he was about to leave. "Thank you, really." There was a raw sincerity in those simple words that struck Mark in a way he hadn't expected. He nodded briefly and closed the door, leaving her alone. Back in the living room, he poured himself another drink and tried to work on some reports on his laptop, but his mind kept returning to the small figure in the guest room. What would he do with her tomorrow? What was his real responsibility in this situation? Why, of all the street children that certainly existed in Boston, had this specific one awakened something inside him? It was almost 2 a.m. when a muffled scream tore him from his thoughts. Without hesitation, he ran to the guest room and opened the door. Emily was sitting up in bed, eyes wide, breathing heavily. A nightmare. "It's okay," he said, approaching cautiously. "It was just a bad dream." Emily looked at him, still trapped in the last images of the nightmare. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't wake me. I was still up." Mark hesitated, uncertain about how to comfort her. "Would you like a glass of water?" She shook her head. "No. It'll pass." Mark noticed that her small hands were clutching the strap of the backpack beside the bed, as if it were a protective amulet. "What do you carry in that backpack that's so important?" he asked, trying to distract her. Emily hesitated for a moment, then opened the backpack and took out a worn notebook with a faded cover. "My drawings," she answered simply. "May I see?" asked Mark, pointing to the notebook. Emily hesitated, her small fingers tightening on the worn edges of the notebook. It was evident that this object represented more than just sheets of paper. It was a refuge, a space of her own in a world that denied her any privacy or control. "They're just drawings," she finally said, extending the notebook reluctantly. "They're not very good." Mark accepted the notebook carefully, aware of the implicit trust in that gesture. He sat on the edge of the bed, maintaining a respectful distance, and began to flip through the pages. The drawings were made with broken colored pencils and nearly dried-up ink pens, but they possessed an expressive quality that transcended the rudimentary technique. There was a blue house near the sea, drawn repeatedly on several pages, sometimes under bright sunshine, others under rain or with a starry sky. A woman with long dark hair appeared in many drawings, always smiling, a brown dog with white spots, and on some pages a male figure with his back turned, as if always walking away. "Is this your house?" asked Mark, pointing to the blue house. "It was," replied Emily, her voice suddenly lower, "before everything changed." "And this is your mother?" he continued, indicating the woman with long hair. Emily nodded, a small, nostalgic smile forming on her lips. She liked to sing while cooking. She said the food tasted better that way. Mark turned a few more pages, noticing how the drawings gradually became darker. The blue house appeared with broken windows, the sky always cloudy, the figure of the mother absent. "And who is this?" he asked, pointing to the male figure with his back turned. Emily's face instantly closed. "Nobody important," she replied, taking back the notebook and closing it. "Just someone who left." Mark understood that he had touched on a sensitive subject and didn't insist. Silence hung between them for a few seconds, punctuated only by the sound of the rain that continued to fall outside. "You draw very well," he finally said. "You have talent." Emily shrugged, but a slight blush on her cheeks revealed that the compliment had touched her. "Tomorrow we can buy some drawing materials. For you if you want," suggested Mark. "New colored pencils, markers, proper paper." Her eyes lit up for an instant, but soon returned to their habitual caution. "You don't need to do that." "I know, but I want to." The simplicity of that answer seemed to surprise Emily. She remained silent for a moment, processing the idea that someone might simply want to do something for her, without obligation or ulterior motive. "Do you think you can sleep now?" asked Mark, standing up. Emily nodded, settling back under the sheets. "The rain doesn't bother me as much in here," she commented, looking at the ceiling. "It seems distant." "That's because we're on the top floor," explained Mark. "And the windows are soundproof." "That must be nice," murmured Emily, her eyes beginning to grow heavy, not hearing the things you don't want to hear. The observation, apparently simple, carried a weight that didn't escape Mark. How much had that child already witnessed in her short life? How many sounds, visions, and experiences would she like to be able to block out? "Good night, Emily," he said, walking to the door. "Good night, Mark," she replied, her voice already thick with sleep. Mark closed the door softly and returned to the living room. His laptop was still open, displaying financial spreadsheets and graphs that a few hours earlier had seemed so important. Now they seemed like empty symbols of a life built on values that suddenly no longer made as much sense. He poured himself another drink and walked to the window. The rain had diminished, transforming into a fine drizzle that blurred the city lights. From there, Boston seemed like a postcard, distant and perfect, but he knew that a few miles away, children like Emily slept in stairwells, shop awnings, and other improvised shelters. His cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Greg Mendez, his partner in the company. "We need to move up the meeting with the investors to tomorrow at 9 a.m. The Portuguese group only has that window available. Confirm?" Mark looked at the hallway that led to the room where Emily was sleeping. What would he do with her in the morning? He couldn't simply send her away, but he also couldn't take her to a business meeting. "Confirmed," he finally replied. "I'll be there." The night advanced slowly. Mark tried to work, but his thoughts kept returning to Emily's drawings and the questions they raised. Who was the male figure with his back turned? What had happened to the blue house by the sea? How had such a young child ended up on the streets of Boston? When the sun began to rise, tinting the Boston sky with shades of pink and orange, Mark realized he had spent the entire night awake. His body accused the fatigue, but his mind was strangely alert. He took a quick shower and put on one of his impeccable suits, preparing for the meeting. Susan arrived promptly at 7 o'clock, as she did every day. Seeing Mark already dressed and ready, she seemed surprised. "Good morning, sir. Is the girl still sleeping?" "Yes, she had nightmares during the night, but eventually fell asleep." Mark hesitated. "Susan, I need to go to an important meeting. Can you keep an eye on her until I return?" The housekeeper nodded. "Of course, sir. I'll prepare a hearty breakfast. She seems to need it." "Thank you." Mark picked up his briefcase and car keys. "And Susan, if she wants to leave, don't stop her, but ask her to wait until I return, if possible." "I understand, sir." The meeting with the Portuguese investors extended throughout the morning. Mark conducted the negotiations with his usual competence, but part of his mind was elsewhere. While they discussed rates of return and growth projections, he wondered if Emily had already woken up, if she had liked the breakfast, if she would still be there when he returned. "Mark, is everything okay?" asked Greg during a break. "You seem distracted." "I'm fine," replied Mark. "Just didn't sleep very well." Greg, a pragmatic man in his 40s, gave a discreet laugh. "Ah, I understand. Busy night? Who's the lucky lady this time?" Mark forced a smile, but didn't answer. Letting Greg think it was a romantic affair was easier than explaining the truth. The meeting ended shortly after noon, with the signing of a memorandum of understanding that ensured substantial investment in the expansion of Richardson Enterprises, to the northeast. Under normal circumstances, Mark would have suggested lunch to celebrate. Instead, he quickly said goodbye and drove back home. Upon entering the apartment, he heard something he had never heard there before: laughter. Following the sound, he found Emily and Susan in the kitchen. The girl was sitting on the counter, with flour on her face and hands, helping the housekeeper prepare what appeared to be cake batter. "Look who's here," said Susan, smiling at Mark. "We're making a chocolate cake. Emily told me she's never made one before." Emily looked at Mark with an almost guilty expression, as if fearing she had crossed some boundary. "That sounds great," he said, placing his briefcase on the table. "Can I try it later?" The girl's face lit up with a smile. "Susan said it's the best cake recipe that exists." And she's right. Susan's cakes are famous. Mark loosened his tie. "I'm going to change clothes, and I'll be right back to help." As Z2. He walked to the bedroom. Mark noticed something different about the apartment. It wasn't a physical change, everything remained in its place, but something in the atmosphere had transformed. The place that had always seemed to him an immaculate but sterile refuge now seemed alive. When he returned to the kitchen, wearing more casual clothes, he found the cake already in the oven and Susan cleaning up the mess. "How was your morning?" he asked Emily, who was now sitting at the table drawing on sheets of paper Susan had found. "It was nice," she replied, without raising her eyes from the drawing. "Susan showed me the building from the window. You can see the ocean from here." "Yes, you can," agreed Mark, sitting across from her. "What are you drawing?" Emily turned the paper so he could see. It was a drawing of the apartment, with its large windows and view of the sea. But unlike the minimalist reality, she had added vibrant colors, plants, and even a dog lying on the living room rug. "It's beautiful," commented Mark, "but I think you added some things that don't exist." "It's how it could be," explained Emily, returning to the drawing. "Sometimes I like to draw things not as they are, but as they could be." That observation, so simple and at the same time so profound, struck Mark like a revelation. It was exactly what he had stopped doing in his own life, imagining how things could be different, better, more colorful. "Sir," interrupted Susan, "while you were busy, I received a call from the front desk. It seems someone posted a video on social media." "What video?" asked Mark, confused. "Of the moment when you invited Emily to sit at the restaurant. Apparently some customer filmed discreetly and published it online. The video is, how do you say, going viral." Mark felt a knot in his stomach. "What exactly does this video show?" "Just the moment when Emily approaches your table and you invite her to sit. The title is something like, 'She only asked for leftovers, and he did the unthinkable.'" "Damn," muttered Mark, running his hand through his hair. "That's all I needed." Emily looked from one to the other, her expression returning to her habitual caution. "Is that bad?" she asked. "Will they be angry with you because of me?" The vulnerability in that question made Mark immediately soften his expression. "No, Emily, it's not bad, just unexpected, and nobody is going to be angry with me, don't worry." But as he said this, his cell phone began to ring insistently. Greg, the company's press office, journalists seeking a statement. The news was spreading quickly, and the image of the powerful businessman Mark Richardson feeding a street child in one of the most exclusive restaurants in Boston had captured the public's imagination. "What are we going to do?" asked Susan, concerned. Mark looked at Emily, who had returned to her drawing, although her strokes now seemed tenser, as if she felt the anxiety in the air. "Nothing," he finally replied. "We're not going to do anything. I don't owe explanations to anyone." But as he said this, he knew it wasn't that simple. The life he had built was based on a carefully cultivated image. Reputation in the business world was an asset as valuable as financial capital, and now that reputation was being rewritten by a viral video that no one had authorized. "Susan, please turn off the landline and don't answer the front desk today. Say I'm not available for visits or interviews." "Yes, sir." Mark's cell phone rang again. It was Greg for the third time. Reluctantly, he answered. "Mark, for God's sake, what's going on? I'm getting calls from every news outlet in Massachusetts." Who is this girl? Why did you take her to dinner? Is this some social project you didn't tell me about? Greg, calm down. It's nothing like that. It was just a human gesture, nothing more. There's no story here. No story? Repeated Greg, incredulous. Mark, you're on the cover of the most accessed news portal in Massachusetts right now. People are speculating, inventing stories. We need to control the narrative. No, we don't. I'm not going to turn a private moment into a media circus. I'm not going to use a child to improve my image or the company's. But, no buts, Greg, trust me. This story will die in a few days when something more interesting comes along for people to comment on. Upon hanging up, Mark wasn't as confident as his words suggested. He knew how the news cycle worked, how stories could grow and transform, taking on a life of their own. The oven timer sounded, announcing that the cake was ready. The aroma of chocolate filled the kitchen, bringing a moment of normality amid the emerging chaos. "Shall we eat cake?" suggested Mark, forcing a smile. For Emily. She studied him for a moment, with that sharp perception that seemed to read beyond words. "Are you sure you're not in trouble because of me?" "I'm sure," he replied, gently holding her small hand. "Some things are more important than what people think or say." As Susan served generous slices of hot cake, Mark made another decision. That, like the first, was not the result of an elaborate plan, but of an inner certainty that grew with each moment. He could not simply return Emily to the streets. Not after everything that had happened. Not after seeing how her presence had transformed the empty apartment into a home. "Emily," he said after a few minutes of comfortable silence, "you told me about Mrs. Wilson yesterday. Do you think you could tell me where she lived? Perhaps we can find out more about your situation." The girl stopped eating, the fork suspended in the air. "Why?" "Because I want to help you, really. Not just with a meal or a dry night, but in a more permanent way." Emily's eyes widened slightly, a spark of hope quickly suppressed by the experience of past disillusions. "You want me to stay here?" "Why?" The same direct question, which always seemed to disarm him. Mark smiled, recognizing the irony. He, who had always been so eloquent in business meetings, who knew exactly how to persuade investors and partners, was being consistently reduced to the essential by a 9-year-old child. "Because I think we need each other," he replied honestly. "And because sometimes families aren't just made of people who are born together, but of people who choose to stay together." The chocolate cake remained on Emily's plate, forgotten for a moment, as she processed those words. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she nodded slightly. "I think I can remember where Mrs. Wilson lived," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "It's near St. Mary's Church, on a street with colorful houses. Hers is green with a yellow door." "Great," said Mark, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Tomorrow we'll go there together. Today let's just rest and eat cake. What do you think?" The small smile that illuminated Emily's face was all the answer he needed. The next morning dawned clear and sunny, as if the storm of the previous night had never existed. Boston awoke in its usual mixture of vibrant colors, aromas of seafood and distant music. From the top of his apartment, Mark observed the city with renewed eyes, aware that in a few hours he would descend from his tower of glass and concrete, to dive into a Boston he rarely visited. "Are you sure you want to do this personally?" asked Richard Lewis, Mark's trusted lawyer, who had been urgently called that morning. "I can send someone from my team to investigate the situation. It would be more discreet." Mark shook his head, observing Emily on the balcony. She was absorbed in drawing with the new materials Susan had provided: professional colored pencils, fine-tipped markers, a special drawing pad. The concentration on her face as she worked was something Mark was beginning to deeply admire. "No, Richard, I need to go personally. I need to understand where she came from, who took care of her, what happened. If I really want to help her, I can't outsource this." The lawyer adjusted his glasses, clearly uncomfortable. "I understand your motivation, Mark, but we need to be practical. The restaurant video already has over 1 million views. Journalists are camped outside your building. If you go out with the girl, it will be a circus." "Then find a way to avoid that circus," replied Mark firmly. "That's what you're paid for." Richard sighed, recognizing the tone that indicated his client wouldn't change his mind. We can use the basement garage and a different car. I have a trusted driver who can take us. Nobody expects you to leave in a common car without the Mercedes. Perfect. Arrange that for an hour from now. When the lawyer left to make the arrangements, Mark joined Emily on the balcony. She was drawing the view of Boston Harbor, capturing, with surprising accuracy, the play of light on the water. "You're getting better and better," he commented, sitting beside her. Emily shrugged, but couldn't completely hide her pride. "These pencils are very good. The colors are more vibrant." "Emily, we're going to leave soon to look for Mrs. Wilson's house. Are you ready for that?" The girl stopped drawing, her body tensing slightly. "What if we don't find it? Or if she's still away?" Mark noticed the hesitation, the way Emily avoided using certain words. "Then at least we'll have tried. And maybe we'll find other people who knew you both, who can help us better understand your situation." Emily nodded slowly. "I think there's a neighbor, Mrs. Johnson. She always gave me cookies when Mrs. Wilson wasn't home." "That's great, Emily. We'll look for Mrs. Johnson too." An hour later, dressed simply to avoid attention, Mark and Emily descended via the service elevator to the basement garage, where a silver Corolla awaited them. Richard was already in the passenger seat, while a middle-aged man with a discreet expression occupied the driver's seat. "This is Paul, my trusted driver," introduced Richard. "He knows the city well and will be discreet." The journey to the St. Mary's Hill neighborhood was silent. Emily observed the city passing by the window, her eyes registering every detail, every change in the landscape, as they left the more affluent areas and entered simpler regions. Mark, in turn, felt increasingly out of place. How many times had he driven past these same streets without really seeing them? How many lives, stories, and daily struggles took place just a few miles from his privileged world? "It's on this street," said Emily suddenly, pointing to a narrow hill that climbed toward the famous church. "The colorful houses are just after the small square." Paul skillfully maneuvered the car through the narrow streets until they reached a set of simple but well-maintained houses, painted in vibrant tones: blue, pink, yellow, orange. Among them, a green house with a yellow door stood out, exactly as Emily had described. "That's it," she confirmed, her voice mixing expectation and apprehension. Mark took a deep breath. "Let's go." As they got out of the car, some residents observed with curiosity. It wasn't common to see well-dressed strangers there, much less accompanied by Paul and Richard, who clearly didn't belong in that environment. Emily, however, seemed strangely at ease, as if part of her recognized that place as home. The greenhouse had a small front garden, where medicinal herbs and resistant flowers grew in recycled aluminum cans. An empty rocking chair on the porch seemed to await the return of someone. Mark felt a knot in his throat as he thought of the woman who used to sit there, the woman who had taken care of Emily when everyone else had failed. Before they could knock on the door, an elderly black woman with grey hair came out of the house next door. Her eyes widened upon recognizing Emily. "My God in heaven, Emily, is that really you, child?" she exclaimed, approaching with quick steps despite her age. "Mrs. Johnson!" Emily ran to the woman, who hugged her tightly, rocking her from side to side. "Jesus, Mary and Joseph, where have you been, child? We were all worried. After Mrs. Wilson went to the hospital, you disappeared. We looked everywhere." Mark and Richard exchanged glances, confirming their suspicions. Emily had really lived there, and people cared about her. "Mrs. Johnson," intervened Mark, approaching with respect. "My name is Mark Richardson. I met Emily a few days ago, and I'm trying to help her find her family or legal guardians." The lady studied him with suspicious eyes. "Are you a social worker? From the police?" "No, ma'am. I'm just someone who cares about her well-being." Mrs. Johnson seemed to evaluate the sincerity in his words before relaxing slightly. "Better come inside. It's not good to talk about other people's lives on the street." Mrs. Johnson's house was small but welcoming. Family photos decorated the walls, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the environment. She indicated the floral-patterned sofa for them to sit on and went directly to prepare coffee and cookies, as if receiving unexpected visitors was the most natural event in the world. Mrs. Wilson's house has been closed since she was hospitalized, explained Mrs. Johnson, returning with a tray. I have the key, in case you need to enter. Do you know how she is? Asked Mark. Mrs. Johnson's face darkened. I haven't had good news. Her nephew, who lives in Springfield, came about 2 weeks ago and said her condition worsened. The doctors don't give much hope. Emily lowered her head, absorbing the information in silence. Mark resisted the urge to touch her shoulder, uncertain about how to comfort her. And what about Emily's situation? Intervened Richard, assuming the professional tone. Do you know if Mrs. Wilson had any documentation, any legal guardianship of the girl? Look, sir, things don't work here with so much formality, replied Mrs. Johnson, serving coffee in colourful cups. Emily's mother, Mrs. Helen, was Mrs. Wilson's neighbour. When she departed this world, it was natural that Mrs. Wilson, who already helped take care of the girl, would assume responsibility. Nobody questioned it, nobody demanded paperwork. It was the right thing to do. And the father? Asked Mark, remembering the figure with his back turned in Emily's drawings. A heavy silence fell over the room. Mrs. Johnson looked at Emily as if measuring what she could say in the presence of the child. Emily, she said gently, why don't you go to the backyard and see if my chickens laid eggs today? You remember where the chicken coop is, don't you? The girl nodded, seeming relieved to be able to leave that adult conversation. When she left, Mrs. Johnson lowered her voice. Emily's father was never present. He would show up from time to time, usually wanting money from Helen. He was a complicated man, involved in wrong things. When Helen got sick, he disappeared for good. Some say he's in jail, others that he fled to Canada. The important thing is that he abandoned his daughter when she needed him most. The information hit Mark like a punch. Now he understood why the figure in Emily's drawings was always, with his back turned, always walking away, and there are no other relatives, grandparents, uncles. Helen was an only child raised in an orphanage. She didn't know her own parents. As for the father's family, well, they never appeared, never showed interest. Richard was taking discreet notes on his cell phone, documenting every relevant piece of information for the legal process he anticipated. Mrs. Johnson, continued Mark, Emily mentioned that Mrs. Wilson kept a letter from her mother. Do you know anything about this? The lady's eyes lit up with recognition. Yes. Helen wrote letters in her final days when she already knew she didn't have much time. She left one for Emily to read when she grew up, and another with instructions. Mrs. Wilson treasured them. Do you know where these letters are now? They must be in the house, probably in Mrs. Wilson's room. She had a wooden box where she kept important documents. Mark exchanged a significant look with Richard. Would it be possible for us to enter the house to look for these letters? They could be fundamental to establish Emily's legal situation. Mrs. Johnson hesitated, again evaluating the visitor's intentions. What is your real interest in the girl, Mr. Richardson? Excuse my frankness, but it's not every day that a man in a suit appears here wanting to help a child who isn't even related to him. The question was fair and direct, like Emily's. Mark appreciated the woman's honesty and decided to respond with the same sincerity. I met Emily by chance at a restaurant. She asked me for food, and something about her touched me. I can't explain it. For the past few days, she has been staying in my apartment, and I realized I can't simply return her to the streets. I want to help her, Mrs. Johnson, really. If that means finding relatives who truly care about her, great. If not, I'm willing to take responsibility. Mrs. Johnson studied his face for long seconds, as if she could read beyond the words. Finally, she nodded and stood up. I'll get the key. You can go to the house, but I want to go with you. Mrs. Wilson trusted me to take care of what's hers. While the lady left to get the key, Richard leaned toward Mark. Are you sure about this? We're talking about a serious commitment, possibly long-term. I'm sure, Richard. I've never been so certain of anything in my life. Mrs. Wilson's house was a reflection of her personality, simple, organized, and welcoming. Old, well-preserved furniture coexisted with local crafts and images of Catholic saints. In the main bedroom, a double bed with a crocheted bedspread dominated the space. Beside it, a small altar with candles, rosaries, and holy cards revealed the owner's devotion. "The box should be in the wardrobe," indicated Mrs. Johnson, opening the doors of an old wardrobe. After a few minutes of searching, they found a carved wooden box locked with a small padlock. "The key should be around here too," murmured Mrs. Johnson, searching among Mrs. Wilson's belongings. She always said she kept it under the saint. Lifting a small image of St. Anthony on the dresser, they found a tiny key. The padlock opened easily, revealing the precious contents of the box: documents, old photos, newspaper clippings, and at the bottom, 2 sealed envelopes. One of the envelopes had written, "For Emily, when she's old enough to understand," in delicate handwriting. The other simply said, "Instructions." "May I?" asked Mark, indicating the second envelope. Mrs. Johnson nodded, handing him the envelope carefully. Mark opened it with respect, aware that he was about to read a mother's last wishes. The letter, written on simple paper, contained only a few paragraphs. "To whom it may concern. If this letter is being read, it means I am no longer present to care for my daughter, Emily. My greatest desire is for her to have a dignified life, with education, affection, and opportunities that I could not have. I have no family who can assume her guardianship. Emily's father was never present and does not have the conditions or interest to raise her. My friend Mrs. Wilson agreed to take care of her as long as she could, but I know she is already of advanced age. If something happens to Mrs. Wilson, I earnestly ask that you seek a family who can love Emily as I loved her. She is a special child, sensitive and talented. She deserves more than life could give me. All of Emily's documents are in this box: birth certificate, vaccination card, school records. I used these documents to officially register her as my daughter, even knowing that my time with her would be brief. With gratitude and hope, Helen Anderson." Boston, April 15, 2023. Mark felt a knot in his throat as he finished reading. The date on the letter was just over a year ago. Helen's simple and direct words, her last act of love for her daughter, deeply moved him. "Did you find them?" Emily's voice came from the bedroom door, where she observed the adults with curious eyes. Mark quickly folded the letter, still processing its contents. "Yes, Emily, we found some important things from your mother." The girl approached slowly, her eyes fixed on the open box. "Can I see?" "Of course you can, my dear," replied Mrs. Johnson, taking the envelope addressed to Emily. "Your mother left this letter for you, but she wrote that it was for when you were old enough to understand." "I am old enough," protested Emily, extending her hand for the envelope. "I can read by myself." The adults exchanged uncertain looks. Richard made a discreet gesture to Mark, suggesting that perhaps it wasn't the appropriate moment. But Mark, observing the determination on Emily's face, made another decision. "You're right, Emily, you are old enough for some things, but others. Perhaps it's better if we keep this letter for when you're a bit older. Your mother wanted you to read it when you could fully understand what she wrote." To his surprise, Emily didn't protest. She nodded with a maturity that continued to surprise him. "All right. Can I keep it with me anyway?" "Of course," replied Mark, handing her the sealed envelope. "It's yours by right." As Emily held the letter against her chest, like an invaluable treasure, Richard discreetly collected the other documents from the box: birth certificate, vaccination card, school records, essential items for any future legal process. "Can we take the rest for analysis?" he asked Mrs. Johnson. "I promise everything will be catalogued and returned when no longer needed." The lady hesitated but eventually agreed. As long as it's for the girl's benefit, Mrs. Wilson would want that. As they left the house, Mark noticed how Emily looked back, her eyes registering every detail, as if wanting to engrave in her memory that piece of her past. There was something deeply moving in that look, a precocious understanding of loss and change. In the car, returning to Beacon Hill, she remained silent, her mother's letter still clutched between her small hands. Mark respected that silence, understanding that some emotional journeys need to be made alone, even when you're only 9 years old. When she finally spoke, already near Mark's building, her voice was small but firm. Are you really going to let me stay with you? The question, as direct as always, caught Mark off guard. He looked at Richard, who nodded discreetly, and then at Emily, whose dark eyes looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. If you want to, he replied honestly. I'm willing to try. I don't know if I'll be good at it, Emily. I've never taken care of anyone but myself, but I promise I'll try my best every day. Emily considered those words for a moment, her face as serious as an adult evaluating an important contract. I'll try hard too, she finally said. I promise not to make too much noise or mess. Something in that response broke Mark's heart. A child shouldn't worry about being convenient, about not bothering. She should worry about playing, learning, growing. Emily, he said, gently holding her hand, you don't need to try to be accepted. That's not how it works. You can make noise, you can make a mess, that's what children do. The apartment is too big for one person anyway. Perhaps it needs a bit more life. A small smile formed on her face, illuminating her eyes. It was the kind of smile that Mark was beginning to value more than any successful business, more than any well-stocked bank account. Can I have a dog? She asked suddenly, a flash of mischief in her gaze. Mark laughed, caught by surprise by the change of subject. A dog? Well, that's something we need to discuss calmly. In my drawing of the apartment there was a dog, she reminded him. You said it was how things could be, not how they are. Richard tried to hide a smile, clearly impressed by the girl's impeccable logic. Mark shook his head, recognizing the imminent defeat. Let's solve one thing at a time, okay? First, we need to take care of the documents and your legal situation. Then we'll talk about the dog. Emily nodded, satisfied not to have received a definitive no. As the car entered the building's garage, she looked one last time at the letter in her hands before carefully storing it in the pocket of the new dress Susan had bought for her. Thank you, she said simply. Mark didn't need to ask what for. He knew the thanks encompassed much more than just the outing that day. It was for everything, for the food at the restaurant, for the dry night during the storm, for the drawing materials, for the promise of a different future. You're welcome, he replied, feeling that the words were inadequate to express what he really wanted to say. How to explain that in truth it was he who should be thanking her? That small figure with drawings and direct questions had filled a void he didn't even know existed. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. The following weeks brought a new routine to the apartment. On Beacon Hill, what was once a meticulously organized and silent space now gained new sounds and colors. Emily's drawings began to occupy the refrigerator, held by colorful magnets that Susan had bought especially for this purpose. A guest room that had never received visitors gradually transformed into a child's space, with bookshelves, a desk for drawings, and a bed with a patterned bedspread chosen by Emily herself. Richard, the lawyer, became a constant presence, bringing documents for Mark to sign and updates on the provisional guardianship process they had initiated. The bureaucracy was complex, full of requirements and evaluations. Social workers began to visit the apartment regularly, asking questions, observing the dynamics between Mark and Emily, evaluating whether that environment was suitable for a child. They're always watching me, commented Mark to Susan after another visit from the court team, as if they're expecting me to make some mistake. It's their job, sir, replied the housekeeper, who now spent more time in the apartment helping with Emily's care. They're just ensuring the girl will be safe. Safe, repeated Mark with a humorless laugh, as if I were some kind of threat. It's not personal, sir. These are standard procedures. You're a single man with no experience with children who suddenly wants guardianship of a 9-year-old girl. It's natural that they ask questions. Mark knew Susan was right, but that didn't make the process any less frustrating. Each form, each interview, each psychological evaluation reminded him of how his life had completely changed in a matter of days. The cold, calculating businessman now needed to prove he had the emotional capacity to care for a child. Meanwhile, Emily began to establish her own routine. After a pedagogical evaluation, she was enrolled in a private school near the apartment. Initially reluctant, she soon discovered a passion for mathematics and arts that surprised her teachers. In the first weeks, Mark hired a driver to take her and pick her up, but he soon realized that this time in the car could be an opportunity to strengthen the bonds between them. He then began to reorganize his schedule to be able to make the journey personally whenever possible. "How was school today?" he asked every afternoon while driving back home. Emily's answers, initially short and hesitant, gradually became more elaborate. She talked about her classmates, the teachers, the classes she liked most. Small windows into her inner world that Mark valued enormously. "There's a girl in my class who always asks me why I live with you and not with my parents," she commented one day, looking out the car window. Mark felt his stomach tighten. "And what do you answer?" "That you're my guardian," she replied simply. "That's what the social worker told me to say." "And does that bother you, what she asks?" Emily shrugged, that characteristic gesture that Mark had learned to interpret as a form of protection when the subject made her uncomfortable. "Sometimes. But the teacher said there are families of all types. Some have a mother and father, others just a mother or just a father, or two fathers or two mothers, and some are formed by people who chose each other." The simplicity and wisdom of that explanation deeply touched Mark. "Your teacher is right. Families are the people we choose to love and care for, no matter if we have the same blood or not." Emily nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. The rest of the journey was made in a comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who have already transcended the need to fill every moment with words. As the relationship between Mark and Emily strengthened, the outside world continued to react in various ways to the new family configuration. The press, initially voracious after the viral video, gradually lost interest when Mark consistently refused to give interviews or turn the situation into a media spectacle. However, his social and professional circle never tired of the subject. "So is it true? Are you really adopting that girl from the video?" asked Renata Meireles, one of the minority partners in the company, during a business dinner. "I'm in the process of obtaining legal guardianship, yes," replied Mark dryly, uncomfortable with the tone of morbid curiosity in the woman's voice. "Fascinating," she commented, sipping her wine. "I always thought you were the type who doesn't get emotionally involved." "People change, Renata," he replied, maintaining his composure. "Sometimes circumstances force us to see the world in a different way." Of course, she agreed without seeming convinced. "But you have to admit that the image of the Shark of Boston taking care of an orphan is unusual, even convenient from a marketing standpoint." Mark felt his blood boil in his veins. "If you're insinuating that I'm using a child to improve my public image, I suggest you carefully rethink your words, Renata. I wouldn't want to have to sue a colleague for defamation." The icy tone and veiled threat reminded everyone at the table exactly who Mark Richardson was. The conversation quickly changed to safer subjects, but the incident left a mark. On the way back home, Mark couldn't stop thinking about Renata's words. Was it possible that others thought this way too, that they saw his relationship with Emily as an image strategy, a way to humanize the ruthless businessman? The idea deeply disturbed him. He knew the corporate world well, knew how narratives worked, how everything could be transformed into a convenient story. But what he felt for Emily was real, visceral, incomprehensible even to himself. How to explain that barefoot girl had disarranged all the emotional architecture he had taken years to build? How to translate into words the exact moment when he decided he needed to protect her, care for her, be part of her life? Upon arriving home, he found Susan and Emily in the kitchen, preparing brigadeiros, Brazilian chocolate truffles. The girl's face was stained with chocolate, and she laughed as she tried to roll the balls with her sticky hands. "Mark, we're making brigadeiros for the school party tomorrow," she announced, proudly displaying a tray of colorful paper cups. "Do you want to help?" The domestic scene, so distant from the tense meetings and aggressive negotiations of his day, brought him a sense of peace that no million-dollar contract had ever provided. "Sure," he replied, removing his jacket and rolling up his shirt sleeves. "But I need to warn you that I've never made brigadeiros in my life." "No problem," assured Emily with seriousness. I'll teach you. And so, the feared businessman Mark Richardson spent the night learning to roll brigadeiros under the watchful supervision of a 9-year-old girl. When Susan said goodbye and went home, the two continued in the kitchen, talking about the day and making plans for the weekend. "Mark," said Emily suddenly as they cleaned up the mess, "do you think the judge will let me stay with you forever?" The question, apparently casual, carried an enormous weight. Mark stopped what he was doing and looked directly at her. "Richard says we have a good case. The social worker's reports have been positive. We have your mother's document expressing the desire for you to go to a family that could take care of you, and we don't have any relatives contesting the guardianship." He hesitated, then decided, to be completely honest. "But the system is complicated, Emily. Sometimes, even when everything seems to be in our favor, unexpected obstacles can arise." "Like the fact that you're alone and have never had children before?" she asked, with that sharp perception that always surprised him. "Yes, that might be a factor. But Richard is arguing that what matters is the quality of the environment and care, not the traditional composition of the family." Emily nodded, processing the information with the seriousness of an adult. "And if they say no, what happens to me?" The question hit Mark like a punch to the stomach. The idea of losing Emily to the system, of seeing her in a shelter or with an unknown family, was unbearable. "I won't let that happen," he promised, surprising himself with the intensity of his own voice. "If necessary, we'll appeal, seek other legal alternatives. We won't give up easily, Emily, that I can guarantee." The girl studied him for a moment, as if evaluating the sincerity of his words. Then, without warning, she approached and hugged him. It was the first time she had initiated physical contact of this kind, and Mark felt a knot in his throat. He returned the hug gently, conscious of the fragility and trust implicit in that gesture. "Thank you," she murmured against his chest. "For what?" "For not giving up." That night, after Emily fell asleep, Mark called Richard. "I need to know exactly where we are in the process and what our real chances are," he said without preamble. "I was just preparing a report for you," replied the lawyer. "We have a hearing scheduled for next week. The judge wants to hear you personally and will also speak with Emily in private." "Is that good or bad?" "It's normal in the process. The judge needs to evaluate if there is genuine affection between you and if the adoption serves the child's best interest." "And do you think we'll succeed?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Mark, I need to be honest with you. A complication has arisen." Mark's stomach sank. "What kind of complication?" "Someone contested the guardianship request. A man named Steve Anderson presented himself to the court, claiming to be Emily's biological father." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Emily's father, the figure, with his back turned in the drawings, the man who, according to Mrs. Johnson, had abandoned his daughter when she needed him most. "This doesn't make sense," protested Mark. "Mrs. Johnson said he was missing, maybe even in jail. Why would he appear now?" "The timing is suspicious," agreed Richard, "especially considering the visibility the case gained with the viral video. He may be seeing an opportunity of some kind. Does he have any proof of paternity?" "He's listed as the father on Emily's birth certificate, which gives him certain legal rights, unless we prove abandonment or other reasons for termination of parental rights. I requested a conciliation hearing before the judge's final decision." Mark felt a growing anger mixed with fear. The idea that this man, who had never cared about Emily, could now claim her as if she were property was revolting. And what if he's really interested in her well-being? He asked, trying to be rational despite the emotional storm he felt. "Then we'll have to prove that, despite this, you can offer a more stable and loving home," replied Richard. "But between us, Mark, my instinct says there's something wrong with this story. I'm investigating this man's background. If he has skeletons in the closet, we'll find them." After hanging up, Mark walked to Emily's room. The door was ajar, allowing the hallway light to partially illuminate the room. She was sleeping peacefully, hugging a teddy bear that Susan had bought. Her face, relaxed in sleep, seemed even younger and more vulnerable. How would he tell her? How would he explain that the man who had abandoned her now claimed rights over her? And more importantly, how would he protect her if the worst happened? In the days leading up to the hearing, Mark intensified his search for information about Steve Anderson. He hired private investigators, mobilized contacts, turned over every stone that might hide that man's past. What he discovered only confirmed his suspicions. Steve had a history of irregular jobs, small scams, and even a police record for assaulting a former business partner. "Is this enough to disqualify him as a father?" he asked Richard, when they were reviewing the documents. "It helps, but doesn't guarantee," replied the lawyer. "The judge will consider multiple factors. The central question will be what's best for Emily." The eve of the hearing was one of the most difficult nights in Mark's life. After much internal debate, he decided that he needed to tell Emily the truth. She deserved to know what was happening, to emotionally prepare herself for what she might face in court. After dinner, he invited her to sit on the balcony, her favorite place in the apartment. The lights of Boston shone against the dark sky, creating an almost magical scenario. "Emily, I need to tell you something important about tomorrow's hearing," he began, carefully choosing his words. "A situation has arisen that we didn't expect." She looked at him with those attentive and serious eyes that seemed to see far beyond what most adults could. "Is it something bad?" she asked directly. "It could be complicated," admitted Mark. "A man has appeared claiming to be your biological father. His name is Steve Anderson." Emily's face visibly paled. Her small hands gripped the arms of the chair so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "He's not my father," she said, with an intensity that surprised Mark. He just showed up sometimes to ask my mother for money. He yelled at her, made her cry." The revelation hit Mark like lightning. It was the first time Emily had spoken so openly about her past, about the family dynamics before losing her mother. "You remember him well, then?" She nodded slowly. "He would come, take money, promise to come back to stay with us, but he never came back. When my mother got sick, he showed up once, saw how she was, and never came back. Emily, tomorrow the judge will want to speak with you in private. He'll ask questions about me, about how you feel living here, and probably about your father, too. It's important that you be completely honest." "I'll tell the truth," she assured, her voice trembling slightly. "I'll say I want to stay with you." Mark felt his heart tighten. The trust and affection she demonstrated were precious gifts he had never expected to receive. "Thank you, Emily. I'll do everything in my power to ensure we can stay together." That night, for the first time since Emily had arrived at the apartment, it was she who had difficulty sleeping. Mark heard her, walking around the room, opening and closing drawers, as if looking for something. When he finally ventured to check what was happening, he found her sitting on the bed, staring fixedly at her mother's letter that she still hadn't opened. "I can't sleep," she admitted when she saw him at the door. "I know. I'm nervous too." "I'm thinking of reading the letter," she said, caressing the envelope with her fingers. "Maybe my mother wrote something that could help." Mark sat beside her on the bed. "It's your decision, Emily, but remember that your mother wrote it thinking you would read it when you were older. There may be things that are difficult to understand now." Emily nodded, considering those words. Finally, she put the letter in the drawer of the bedside table. "I'll wait a little longer, but I know what my mother would want." "What?" "For me to be happy," she replied simply, "and I am happy here with you." Those simple words, spoken with Emily's characteristic sincerity, were like a balm for Mark's anxiety. Regardless of what happened in court the next day, he knew he had made a difference in that child's life, and she, without a doubt, had transformed his. "Would you like me to stay until you fall asleep?" he offered. "You can stay," she replied, lying down and pulling up the blanket. "Just until I fall asleep." Mark sat in the armchair next to the bed, watching as Emily slowly surrendered to fatigue. His thoughts were a mixture of fear, hope, and a fierce determination to protect that small life that, by some inexplicable miracle, had been entrusted to his care. Tomorrow they would face the system together, an absent father who had suddenly appeared, and a judge who would have the power to separate them or keep them united. But at that moment, in the quietness of the room, with Emily's now deep and regular breathing, Mark made a silent promise. No matter the outcome, she would never be alone again. The Suffolk County Courthouse in Boston's historic center commanded respect with its imposing architecture. On that sunny morning, the building seemed even more intimidating to Mark and Emily, who arrived early for the hearing. She wore a simple navy blue dress chosen by Susan with care to appear appropriate without being ostentatious. Her hair had been tied in 2 side braids, giving her an organized but still childlike appearance. Mark had opted for a discreet grey suit without a tie. He wanted to appear respectful to the court, but not excessively formal. Richard was waiting for them. On the steps of the entrance, organized folders under his arm and a confident expression that Mark knew well from other legal battles. However, this time what was at stake was infinitely more valuable than any contract or business merger. "Are you ready?" asked the lawyer, greeting them with a handshake. Mark nodded, gently placing his hand on Emily's shoulder. "We are." "Any news about him?" "He arrived 20 minutes ago with his lawyer," replied Richard in a low voice. "I tried a preliminary conversation, but they were immovable. They're determined to take the case forward." Emily looked around with attentive eyes, absorbing every detail of the environment. Although she tried to appear calm, the tension in her small shoulders was evident. "Everything will be all right," murmured Mark, gently squeezing her shoulder. "Remember what we talked about. Just tell the truth." She nodded, her eyes meeting his with a confidence that deeply moved him. The interior of the courthouse was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, full of hurried people carrying stacks of documents. After passing through security, they were led to a waiting room where other families awaited their respective hearings. In the opposite corner, a middle-aged man with graying hair at the temples conversed in a low voice with another man in a suit. When he raised his eyes and saw Emily, his expression subtly changed. Steve Anderson was physically different from what Mark had imagined. He didn't seem like the cartoon villain his mind had constructed, but an ordinary man with tired eyes and worry lines. For a brief moment, Mark wondered if he was being unfair in his judgments. Perhaps this man really wanted a second chance with his daughter. This momentary doubt dissipated when he saw Emily's reaction. The girl, upon recognizing her father, instinctively moved closer to Mark, as if seeking protection. Her entire body tensed, and he could feel the slight tremor in her shoulders under his hand. "Is that him?" asked Mark softly, leaning down. Emily merely nodded, without taking her eyes off the man. Before any interaction could happen, a door opened and a court officer called their names. It was time. The courtroom was smaller and less intimidating than Mark had imagined. A U-shaped table dominated the space, with the judge seated at the head. Judge Anthony Miller was a man in his 60s, with white hair and thin-framed glasses. His expression was serious, but not severe. "Good morning, everyone," he began after the initial formalities. "We are here to discuss the guardianship of the minor Emily Anderson. Before hearing from the lawyers, I would like to speak with Emily herself in private. It's standard procedure in these situations." Mark felt a knot in his stomach. Although he knew this would happen, the idea of Emily facing this moment alone distressed him. "Mr. Richardson, Mr. Anderson, please wait outside while I talk with Emily," instructed the judge. "Your lawyers may remain." Before leaving, Mark crouched down to be at eye level with Emily. "Everything will be fine. The judge just wants to get to know you and hear what you think. Remember, just the truth." She nodded, her large eyes fixed on his. "I know. I'm not afraid." That courage, coming from someone so small who had already faced so much, made Mark feel a wave of pride mixed with sadness. He gently squeezed her hand before leaving the room. In the hallway, Mark and Steve inevitably found themselves side by side, united by circumstance, but separated by an abyss of distrust. "She looks good," commented Steve after a few minutes of tense silence. "She's taller than I remembered." Mark looked at him, unable to completely hide his hostility. "Children grow fast," especially when they have to fend for themselves. Steve shrugged, his face hardening. Look, I know what you're thinking, that I'm an absent father who suddenly appeared out of interest. But you don't know anything about me or my history with Helen and Emily. I know enough, replied Mark coldly. I know you weren't there when your daughter needed you most. I know she slept in stairwells and asked strangers for food while you were... Where exactly? Springfield, Canada? I was in jail, admitted Steve, his voice lowering considerably. Not for crimes, as you must be thinking. It was a confusion with debts, documents. When I got out and found out about Helen, I tried to find Emily, but nobody knew where she was. Until a viral video showed exactly where to find her, completed Mark without hiding his skepticism. Think what you want. She's my daughter. I have rights. Rights? The word ignited something in Mark. Rights come with responsibilities, Mr. Anderson. Where were your responsibilities when Emily was hungry? When she got sick with no one to take care of her? When she cried at night afraid of the rain? Steve didn't respond immediately. For an instant, something like shame crossed his face. I made mistakes. Many. But that doesn't mean I can't try to fix things now. Before Mark could respond, the courtroom door opened. The court officer called them both back. Emily was already seated again, her face composed but with slightly red eyes as if she had cried a little. Judge Miller adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before speaking. I've talked extensively with Emily, and I'm satisfied with her maturity and clarity. Now I'd like to hear from the parties. Mr. Anderson, as the biological father, you have legal priority. Please explain why you wish to reassume guardianship of your daughter after this period of absence. Steve stood up, visibly nervous. Your Honor, I know my absence seems unforgivable. I was in jail for financial problems, and when I got out, about 2 months ago, I found out that Helen had passed away, and that Emily was under the care of an elderly lady. When I finally located this lady, I discovered she was hospitalized, and Emily had disappeared. I was desperate. That's when I saw the video and knew she was with Mr. Richardson. The judge listened attentively, making occasional notes. And now do you feel prepared to assume the responsibility of raising your daughter alone? Yes, Your Honor. I now have a stable job, I've rented a suitable apartment, and I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to give Emily the life she deserves. I made mistakes, but I want the chance to be the father she needs. The judge nodded and turned to Mark. Mr. Richardson, you have no previous biological or legal connection to the child. However, you have demonstrated commitment to her well-being. In recent months, please explain why you believe it would be better for Emily to remain under your care. Mark felt the weight of that moment. Everything depended on what he would say now. He stood up, but instead of looking at the judge, he first looked at Emily, seeking strength in those eyes that had changed his life. Your Honor, I didn't plan to become responsible for a child. It was never part of my plans. Until 2 months ago, my life was completely different. He paused, organizing his thoughts. When Emily appeared at the restaurant that night, something changed. I can't explain exactly what or how, but I know. I was never the same again. In the last few months, we've built a relationship based on trust and mutual respect. She has a room in my home, is adapting well to school, has stability and security. Mark took a deep breath before continuing. I'm not here to judge Mr. Anderson or his intentions. I'm here because I care deeply about Emily's well-being and believe that, at this moment in her life, after so many losses and uncertainties, stability is fundamental. She's already gone through too many changes. Tearing Emily away from an environment where she finally feels safe would be cruel, regardless of the good intentions behind it. The judge considered his words for a few moments. Mr. Richardson, I understand your position, but I need to ask, are you aware that raising a child is a long-term commitment? It's not something done on impulse or momentary emotion. I'm fully aware, Your Honor. I didn't make this decision lightly. In the last few months, I've reorganized my professional and personal life to prioritize Emily. I hired tutors to help her catch up on missed school content, sought psychological guidance to adequately deal with her trauma, and most importantly, I learned to be the adult she needs. I'm not asking for Emily's guardianship as a favor to her, but because I genuinely believe we form a family, albeit unconventional." The judge nodded again and turned to Emily. "Emily, we've already talked in private, but now in the presence of everyone, I'd like to ask, is there anything else you'd like to say before I make my decision?" Emily looked first at Mark, then at Steve, and finally at the judge. When she spoke, her voice was small but firm. "I want to stay with Mark," she said simply. "He never promised me anything he didn't fulfill. He's always there when I wake up from a nightmare. He learned to braid my hair, even though he was really bad at it in the beginning." A small smile appeared on her lips as she said this, "and he lets me draw as much as I want." The simplicity and honesty of those words seemed to touch everyone in the room. Even Steve's lawyer seemed uncomfortable. "Thank you, Emily," said the judge kindly. "I'm going to ask everyone to wait outside the room for a few minutes while I consider my decision." The minutes that followed were the longest in Mark's life. In the hallway he paced back and forth, unable to stand still. Richard tried to calm him, reiterating that they had presented a solid case, but Mark barely heard. All his attention was focused on Emily, who was sitting on a nearby bench, calmly drawing in a small pad she had brought in her bag. To his surprise, Steve approached her hesitantly. Mark immediately became alert, ready to intervene, but maintained enough distance to respect the moment. "Can I see what you're drawing?" asked Steve, his voice surprisingly gentle. Emily looked at him for a moment, then turned the pad so they could see. It was a drawing of Mark's apartment with the view of Boston Harbor through the window. There was a dog in the drawing, lying on a rug in the living room. "It's beautiful," commented Steve. "You always liked to draw. You got that from your mother." Emily seemed surprised. "My mother drew?" "Yes, she was very talented. She used to draw landscapes, mainly the sea." Steve hesitated, then continued, his voice lower. "Emily, I know I wasn't a good father. I don't even know if I deserve to be called that. But I want you to know that, regardless of what the judge decides today, I care about you. I always cared, even when I didn't show it in the right way." Emily studied him with those serious eyes that seemed to see far beyond the surface. "Why did you never come back? When Mum got sick?" The direct question, characteristic of Emily, seemed to hit Steve like a physical blow. He ran his hand over, his face visibly shaken. "I was afraid," he finally admitted. "Afraid of not being able to take care of you, of failing when you needed me most. So I did what I always did when I was afraid. I ran. It was wrong, it was cowardly, and I deeply regret it." Mark observed the scene with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to interrupt, to protect Emily from those painful truths. But another part recognized that this conversation might be necessary for her to someday make peace with her past. Before the conversation could continue, the court officer appeared, announcing that the judge was ready to deliver his decision. Everyone returned to the room, the tension palpable in the air. Judge Miller adjusted his glasses and looked directly at those present. After carefully considering all relevant factors, including the minor's emotional and physical well-being, her adaptation to the current environment, the effective bonds formed, as well as the biological father's legal rights, I have reached a decision. Mark felt his heart race. Beside him, Richard placed a hand on his shoulder in a gesture of silent support. Provisional guardianship of Emily Anderson will remain with Mr. Mark Richardson for a period of 6 months, during which supervised visits with the biological father, Mr. Steve Anderson, will be conducted in a neutral environment and with psychological accompaniment. After this period, a new evaluation will be performed to determine permanent guardianship. Mark felt a wave of relief, so intense that for a moment he feared his legs wouldn't support him. Emily beside him took his hand and squeezed it tightly. "Mr. Anderson," continued the judge, "the court recognizes your biological bond and your desire to reconnect with your daughter. However, Emily's emotional well-being is our priority. This transition period will allow you to build a healthy relationship without causing more trauma to the child. If you demonstrate consistent commitment and create a suitable environment, you may seek shared custody in the future." Steve nodded, his face a mixture of disappointment and resignation. "I understand, Your Honor. Thank you for the opportunity." "Mr. Richardson," the judge turned to Mark, "the court recognizes your commitment to Emily's well-being and the effective bond formed between you. Continue providing stability and emotional support during this transition period. It is essential that you facilitate, not obstruct, the relationship between Emily and her biological father, always focusing on what's best for her." "Yes, Your Honor," replied Mark, feeling humble before the responsibility that had just been reaffirmed. "I will do my best to always act in Emily's best interest." The judge finally looked at the girl. "Emily, I know all this might seem confusing and scary, but I want you to know that all the adults in this room, including me, want what's best for you. Sometimes adults disagree about what that means, but everyone cares about you. In the coming months, you will continue living with Mr. Richardson, but you'll also have the opportunity to get to know your father better. Do you have any questions you'd like to ask?" Emily thought for a moment, then shook her head. "No, Judge, I just wanted to know if I can bring my dog when I visit my father." The question caught everyone by surprise. Mark and Richard exchanged confused glances. "Dog?" asked the judge, consulting his papers. "I don't have a record of a pet." "We don't have one yet," explained Emily naturally. "But Mark promised we could have one after all this was over. I've already chosen the name. It will be Caramel." A discreet smile formed on the judge's lips. "Well, that's something you, Mr. Richardson, and your father will have to discuss at another time, but it sounds like a good plan." With a bang of the gavel, the hearing was adjourned. In the hallway, Richard discussed the next legal steps with Mark, while Emily waited patiently. Steve approached hesitantly to the group. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked, addressing Mark. Richard gave a warning look, but Mark nodded. "Sure. I wanted to—" "Thank you," said Steve, seeming genuinely sincere, "for taking care of her when I couldn't or wouldn't." He paused, gathering courage. "I'll respect the judge's decision. I'll do my best to build a relationship with Emily during the visits without pressuring or complicating things." Mark studied the man before him. There was something different in his eyes now, a humility that wasn't present before. "I'm glad to hear that. What matters is her well-being." "I agree." Steve looked at Emily, who was watching the conversation attentively. "Emily, we'll see each other soon, okay? No rush, in your own time." She nodded, her expression serious but no longer fearful. "Okay." When Steve walked away, Mark crouched down to be at eye level with Emily. "How are you feeling?" "Good," she replied, but then frowned. "Mark, do you think it's possible to have two different fathers? One you were born from, and another you chose?" The question, so profound coming from someone so young, caught Mark off guard. "I think so, Emily. Families come in all shapes and sizes. The important thing is that there's love, respect, and care." She nodded, processing the information. "Then I think I'm lucky now." "Why?" "Because maybe I can have both." She took Mark's hand. "Can we go home? I want to show Susan my new drawing." "Of course, let's go home." The journey back to Beacon Hill was made in a comfortable silence. Emily fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted after the emotional tension of the day. Mark observed her through the rearview mirror, amazed at the resilience of that small person who had transformed his life in ways he could never have imagined. When they arrived at the apartment, Susan was anxiously waiting for them. Upon learning of the result, she hugged Emily tightly, tears of relief running down her face. Then, to everyone's surprise, she hugged Mark as well. "I knew it would work out," she said, emotional. "You two were meant to be family." That night, after dinner, Mark found Emily on the balcony, drawing in the soft light of the evening. He approached quietly, observing over her shoulder. It was a drawing of three people holding hands, a small girl between two adult men, all smiling. In the background, the blue house near the sea that appeared in many of her previous drawings. "It's a beautiful drawing," he commented, sitting beside her. "It's how things could be," she explained, using the phrase that had become a kind of mantra between them. "Not how they are, but how they could be." "And is that how you'd like it to be, everyone me together?" Emily considered the question for a moment. I don't know, but I think it would be good to get to know him better, to know where I came from. She paused, adding some details to the drawing. But you're my family now. You and Susan and Caramel when he arrives. Mark laughed. Ah, so the dog is no longer in negotiation? You promised, she reminded him with a small mischievous smile, after everything was over. Indeed, I promised, he agreed, acknowledging defeat. I guess we'll have to visit some animal shelters this weekend. Emily's smile lit up her face in a way that still made Mark's heart tighten. It was amazing how, in such a short time, that child had become the center of his universe, the axis around which everything else revolved. Emily, he said after a few moments of comfortable silence, remember when you asked me, that first night at the restaurant, why I was helping you? She nodded without taking her eyes off the drawing. I think I finally have an answer, he continued. I helped you because somehow I knew you would also help me, that we needed each other. Emily raised her eyes, studying his face with that characteristic intensity. How did you know? I didn't know consciously, but something inside me recognized something in you, as if we were destined to be family. Even though we're not of the same blood? Especially because we're not of the same blood, confirmed Mark. Because we chose each other, and sometimes, Emily, the families we choose are the strongest of all. She considered those words for a moment, then returned to her drawing, adding, a final detail, a golden dog at the feet of the three figures. I think I understand, she finally said. It's like in my drawings. We imagine how things could be and then we work to make them real. The wisdom of that simple observation struck Mark deeply. That was exactly what they had done in the last few months, imagined a different possibility and worked to make it reality. An unconventional family, built on daily choices, small gestures of affection, promises kept, trust slowly earned. As the sun set over Boston Harbor, tinting the city sky with shades of orange and pink, Mark realized that his life had been completely redrawn, as if Emily had taken her colored pencils and transformed what was once a black and white existence into something vibrant and multidimensional. The cold, calculating businessman, obsessed with spreadsheets and results, now learned to make braids, to answer impossible questions, to comfort nighttime nightmares, to value small daily achievements. And in return, he received the invaluable gift of being needed, of being important, of being loved not for what he owned or represented, but simply for who he was. It's getting late, he said softly. Time to put away the drawings for today. Emily nodded, carefully collecting her materials. Before going in, however, she stopped and looked one last time at the horizon where the city lights began to twinkle against the darkening sky. Mark. Yes. Thank you for not giving up. He smiled, feeling his heart full. I should be thanking you, Emily, for teaching me that some leftovers can transform into something whole. And as they entered together the apartment that was now truly a home, Mark knew with a certainty that transcended any logic or reason that the girl's request on a hot summer night had been the beginning not only of her transformation, but of his own. What had begun with, "Can I eat the rest?" had transformed into a journey of mutual discovery, of learning, of growth. And even though the path ahead had its complexities, supervised visits, periodic evaluations,